Here we are, week 3 overview of our 2023 chronological Bible readings. And this week, I'm actually going to send out another PDF sheet going over the chapters. I didn't get to do that last week, but I'm going to do that this week. There's a lot of material to cover. So let me give an overview. Hopefully, it won't take too many minutes, but let's just dive right in. This week, you're going to be reading the last 3 chapters in Job, chapters 40, 41, and 42. And then we're going to go back to Genesis 12. So in Job 40, 41, and 42, this is where we see God continuing to address Job. And it's still a little bit firm, without a doubt. But what you're also seeing is that Job is realizing who he's in the presence of, and he's coming back to his senses. But I have to admit, humanly speaking, his friends were not very nice to him at all. They were assuming that Job's troubles were connected to some secret sin. They accused him of multiple things. And now God is going to step in and he's going to talk to Eliphaz or Eliphaz, the oldest one. And he's going to say, I'm not going to listen to you. You're going to have to get Job to pray for you. And I just have to say that that's quite satisfying in a fleshy way. I don't really like to put it that way. But nonetheless, God restores Job. It's an incredible finish to an incredible book. And then back to Genesis we go. And folks, Genesis 12 introduces a character. Although he's mentioned in Genesis 11, we really see God's promise made back in Genesis chapter 3 concerning the promise of one who would come, that being the Messiah. And now we're really going to kick that storyline into gear, because in Genesis 12 through 29, we're covering the life of Abraham, his wife Sarah, their son Isaac, and then Isaac becomes the father of Jacob and Esau. There's a lot in these chapters, and it's going to be so good. But remember, this is God keeping his promise to send Messiah. Although Messiah wasn't going to be born for a long, long time, we have to have a line. So in chapters 12 through 15, this is where you see God calling Abram. Now, his name's going to be called Abraham later. We're not there yet. But in 12 through 15, God makes a promise to Abram that he's going to be the father of many nations. And in that, all of the nations will be blessed. The Apostle Paul says in Galatians that God was preaching the gospel when he said that, because ultimately what God was talking about was sending Abraham a son who would have a son, who would have a son, who would have a son, and so on, until finally the day would come when Jesus of Nazareth would be born, the Messiah, God in human flesh. We're a long way from that, but Genesis 12 picks up the messianic line that started back with Seth, one of the sons of Adam and Eve. Now, one of the things you're going to notice in this narrative is that although Abram is a man who ultimately believes God, takes God at his word, and God reckons his faith to him as righteousness, he's still a human being who is prone to doubt God and prone to sin, just like you and I. So in chapter 16, you're going to find Abram's wife, Sarai at the time, saying, hey, let's help God out, which God didn't need any help. And sure enough, a son is born by the name of Ishmael, not the son whom God promised. In chapter 17 of Genesis, we have the circumcision covenant is introduced. By the way, Abram believed God well before he was circumcised. And Abram believed God well before there was a Mosaic law. Abraham was saved by faith. Don't miss that. By God's grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus Christ alone. And if you say, well, Abraham didn't know Jesus' name, nobody knew that God had made a promise to send one, and he was taking God at his word. Now, Genesis 18 through 20. This gets tough. Why? The Lord visits Abraham and Sarah a year before Isaac was to be born. So that's incredible. But it's been 24 years since God made that promise. So Abraham and Sarah are really wondering, is God going to be able to do this? But then we also read about a very troubling instance in the book of Genesis, that being the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, these two very real places. Now, in recent times, there has been a push to make the argument that Sodom was not destroyed because of immorality, but because they were inhospitable. And they take that from Ezekiel 16, which, by the way, I'm not contradicting Ezekiel, but to get to that place, you have to completely ignore the Genesis narrative. You have to ignore Jeremiah 23, and you have to ignore in the New Testament that one chapter book of Jude there in verse 7 where Jude says, no, they were destroyed. They were evil. They were sexually immoral. And folks, that is the main reason why God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Sexual immorality. He hated it then. He still hates it today. So that makes you wonder, well, what is sexual immorality? Any sexual activity that God does not condone. And the only sexual activity that God condones is that within a marriage covenant, Genesis 2:24. Jesus points back to that covenant. Paul points back to that covenant, and here it is. One male, that's Hebrew ish, male, not female, will be married to an isha, a female, not a male. So that's God's standard, one male and one female. That's it. And for those who say, well, in the Bible, there were those who committed polygamy. Yeah, the Bible describes that, but it never prescribes it, never says that it's good. So Genesis 18 through 20, going to be a tough section, but read it. In chapter 21 of Genesis, Isaac is finally born. 25 years after God made the promise, the Lord proved, I can do what I want to do when I want to do it. Chapter 22 of Genesis, some years pass and God says, Abraham, give Isaac back to me. And Abraham is ready to take the life of Isaac. The writer of Hebrews in chapter 11 tells us that Abraham believed God so much that if he took Isaac's life, he believed that God would give him back. Even before resurrection was talked about, Abraham believed that God was the God who could raise the dead. What a powerful story. Now, I'm skipping some here. In chapter 24 of Genesis, Isaac marries Rebekah. And in chapter 25, pay very close attention in this chapter, and here's why. The writer is Moses, but he's giving us a historical narrative here about how long Abraham lived. It's 175 years. Well, after he says that, you find out that Isaac becomes a dad. And you think, oh man, I wish that Abraham could have seen that. Well, friend, he did. Because Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. We're told in the Genesis narrative that Isaac was 60 when his sons were born, which would make Abraham 160. And earlier there in chapter 25, it says Abraham lived to be 175 years old. What does that mean? Abraham got to see Jacob for 15 years. I love how the Lord, he makes him wait, but he always reminds Abraham, I am faithful to keep my promises. Now, chapter 26, the Lord repeats the promise that he had made to Abraham. He repeats that to Isaac. Chapter 27, and a lot's going on here, but Rebekah and Jacob together deceive Isaac and Esau. That's a very sad chapter, a lot of deception. And then in chapters 28 and 29, Jacob is going to have to flee for his life because Esau wants to kill him. And then he goes to his relatives and he meets one of his cousins named Rachel, and he wants to marry her. And then it turns out that he gets deceived, marries a girl named Leah, Rachel's sister, but then is able to marry Rachel. Okay, think about that. He is married to two women at the same time. Does the Bible say that it's good? No. Again, it's describing polygamy, never saying that it was acceptable. But here's what we see, at least to this point in the narrative. The children of Jacob begin to be born. 4 sons that Leah is able to conceive. They are Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. And that's where we're going to stop for this coming week's reading. Now, I've already done it, but I'm telling you, it is so good. I love the Old Testament narratives, and I hope that you are loving them too. Hope to see you next week right here, same bat time. Well, maybe not the same bat time, but at least on the same bat channel. Have a good day.